These days, we are all facing demanding times due to COVID-19. Education is not an exception, and educators worldwide have all been scrambling to produce the best educational experiences and outcomes, but things have not been perfect. Mindfulness and compassion can play an essential role as catalysts and enablers to promote student success in the remote classrooms today. Hello, my name is Jungwoo. My students call me Dr. J and I go by JR among my colleagues. I'm professor of information sciences and technology at Penn State, and I also serve as the head of our division called Business Engineering and Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State Altoona. I started teaching in 2005 and have significant experience as an administrator in higher education. Jill?
Nice to be here today. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Jill Castek. I'm an associate professor at the University of Arizona in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Studies. I'm an enthusiastic career educator with experience teaching at all levels of the education system, from early elementary learners to their parents, to middle school and high school, pre-service and in-service teachers, and of course, graduate students.
Here is a brief overview of our talk. Our presentation consists of these three parts. Part one discusses effective emergency remote teaching, or ERT, principles. Part two lays out specific strategies for making ERT more mindful and compassionate. And part three is a moderated Q&A session. My dear friend, Dr. Larry Reagan from Reagan Education will pose some thought-provoking questions to us based on our presentation, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Earlier this year, educators got caught off guard and had to scramble to teach remotely, literally overnight, to adjust to the new realities of COVID-19. We have a term for this type of teaching. It's temporary. It's a temporary instructional response to an emergency, and we call this emergency remote teaching. ERT is marked by an abrupt change in teaching modalities. In the case of the 2020 pandemic, we've shifted from in-person to remote teaching. Many of us have been trying to find ways to engage students and meet their needs, despite insufficient time and resources to prepare for these changes. And uncertainties about how long we'll need to teach online. It can be a stressful experience. As educators, we're consistently rising to the occasion and making the most of all situations to support our students. It's who we are, it's what we do. Educators use ingenuity to turn challenges into opportunities. Over the summer, we polled teachers in a live session to ask them about their experiences with ERT. Several of the participants were overwhelmed and pointed to Zoom fatigue and more work. But others remarked at the positives, such as the opportunity to build flexibility in learning strategies, to build tech savviness in themselves and their students, while some described the experience as fun, a new way, achievable, and not too difficult. As our experiences with ERT have extended deep into the fall, the more we've tried out and the more we've played with, the better we feel about the experiences. We've illustrated our ability to adapt, be flexible, and we've learned tips and tricks from each other along the way. Those tips and tricks are embedded in this presentation today.
So I've been teaching online for many years, and I can tell you that there are certainly differences between online teaching and ERT. For one, you have time to prepare. I usually spend 6 months to 1 year with an instructional designer to develop an online course. And there's no such luxury in ERT. ERT forces you to change your teaching mode abruptly, and the switch is supposed to be temporary rather than permanent. Because of the sudden and disruptive nature of ERT, the transition is usually rough and rugged, as demonstrated in the participant feedback as shown here. And you see some of these negative comments, and you can see their frustration about not being able to have this in-person, face-to-face interactions.
There are several considerations unique to emergency remote teaching. There's a lack of time to prepare. There are also many uncertainties. There is no clear endpoint to a pandemic. Oftentimes, resources are tight. Many schools have had to reduce their budgets and freeze hiring. All of these aspects of ERT are mostly out of our control as frontline educators, but we do have a better handle for what we could do in our classrooms to increase engagement, communication, and illustrate care and compassion for what our students are experiencing. We listen, we empathize, we communicate, and we redesign to meet the needs of those around us. Before sharing our tips we've gathered today, we want to keep in mind two really important principles throughout our talk today. First, there are no perfect solutions. There are no silver bullets when it comes to working with our students and meeting the needs of all of our students in all situations. And no technique will work without cultivating and demonstrating genuine caring for our students. In short, we need to be responsive and flexible. We need to be present and accessible. In many ways, we need to model for our students what it means to stay engaged, what it means to be communicative, and what it means to remain connected. These are guiding principles in our talk today.
Let's start with engagement principles. ERT certainly makes engagement more difficult. The other day, I had to do a classroom observation because of a student complaint, and there were 2 students in the classroom, and the rest of them were online. Nobody had their cameras turned on, including the instructor who was just sharing his screen. Do you think that this type of environment promotes student engagement? I think we can do better, and we need to make more conscious efforts to avoid falling into a trap like this scenario. The key here is recognizing your role as a community organizer and facilitator for your students, which is especially critical in ERT to promote student engagement. And here are some concrete steps to do that. First, provide frequent feedback in a timely and meaningful manner. Second, make routine announcements. I prefer video to text. Third, take advantage of online discussion forums. Let's get into some technical aspects of how we can do this. Zoom is one of the tools we're using these days a lot, and Zoom has many features that encourage interactions and engagement. And these range from simple chat to polling and breakout rooms. If you want to take this to the next level and have students collaborate voluntarily and engage in higher order thinking, you have options like Microsoft Teams, Mural, or Jamboard. What about communication, which is a crucial mechanism to check the pulse of your class and provide the necessary support for your student success? Here, the keywords are steady and frequent. When it comes to the mode of communication, ask your students which mode they prefer and try to meet your students at their level. Here are some technology considerations for communication outside the classroom. Be mindful of the fact that your students may prefer mobile apps to desktop applications. Try to use multiple modes of communication with your students. This way, you have redundancies. That is, you can try to call on their cell phones if they don't respond to your emails. Videos and emojis are effective tools to show your empathy. Assessment and accountability offer another opportunity, and I constantly hear from our faculty about how the conventional assessment methods are no longer effective in ERT, and I do agree with them. In particular, academic integrity or AI requires extra attention. The first step is to educate your students about plagiarism and cheating. Many schools already have written codes of conduct regarding AI. Make them more visible. Finally, design your classes to minimize AI violations by assigning more small and low stake assessments. The technology options to consider for AI are using question banks, randomizing questions and answers in your assessment, or buying commercial proctoring services.
For us to be able to try and implement these techniques and use these technologies, educators need to build a solid foundation. We believe the foundations of our teaching are built on compassion and mindfulness. Compassion is a concern for students' well-being beyond their academic advancement, their well-being as humans. And then there's mindfulness, the conscious and conscientious and intentional efforts to check in with people. It refers to the basic human ability to think twice before taking action. Simply being mindful and compassionate is not enough. We need to build a thriving learning community to engage students more effectively and invite their active participation. So here are some tips and tricks we've built into our teaching along the way. First, create opportunities to learn about your students. Not just to think of them as academic beings, but to get to know them, to get to make connections to who they are outside the classroom. Find out about their goals, about their challenges. Take notes, check in, find ways to make those personal connections that last. Create an environment that builds from student interests, is interactive and flexible, and is multimodal, creating plenty of opportunities to engage in different ways. That might be video, it might be images, it might be drawing. As you build student community and involvement, take note of students' preferences and design learning that is responsive to what they say they enjoy, what makes them feel heard, and in what ways they express their preferences. In my teaching, I like to use modalities that invite humor and empathy and connections and allow us to learn about each other. Just the other day, we did a drawing activity. And this is not about being artistic, it really is about making connections. We drew our favorite October and fall treat. No two were the same. And we had the ability to tell stories and to break the ice to spark new connections around the difference between Reese's peanut butter cups and Reese's pumpkin peanut butter cups, for example. Any way that we can break the ice, get students outside their heads to think and feel and connect is an important way to be mindful and compassionate.
I sometimes run into awkward situations with my students when they ask for favors. Like, can you allow me to resubmit my assignment only this time? And I avoid these difficult encounters by making it official in the form of oops coupons. This way, I treat everybody fairly. We are all making mistakes from time to time, especially in the beginning of the semester. Students are prone to miss elements in assignments or forget about things. We can make this a teachable moment by being compassionate. Let's focus on teaching instead of punishment. How do we make our communications with our students more mindful and compassionate? I would say the best thing to do is to establish the right expectations from the very beginning when you first meet your students, because it's probably too much for you to be expecting your students to be behaving in a certain way without telling them what to do. Don't make any assumptions. By making your expectations very clear from the very beginning of your semester, you can avoid a lot of these problems. Trying to do something in the middle of your semester can lead to both you and your students being stressed out. Here are some other tips for mindful and compassionate communication. I think a lot of what I'm talking about here is what we try to practice in-person teaching situations. In my case, I always try to be available before and after classes, and the same applies to ERT. You want to make yourself available before a Zoom session or after a Zoom session, whether it's online or offline. Always try to arrange a predictable time and space for drop-in support or socializing. Having this type of personal connections is also very critical in making your communications with your students more effective. So sharing personal stories and inviting your students to be open with you is another key. My third communication tip to be more mindful and compassionate is very technical. And in this case, because of my technical expertise in cybersecurity, I want to emphasize the fact that security is very important, especially if you remember those moments of Zoom bombing in our previous semester. To be able to prevent any unfortunate incidents like that, I would say following certain precautions is really important. I mean, it could be as simple as setting up a waiting room in your Zoom setting. And even during your classes, maybe in order to avoid disrupting students, it's important to be using features like muting or turning videos on and off.
Well, most of us are expected to use the Zoom platform for our teaching due to institutional licenses. It was designed for a corporate or business environment, and it doesn't always meet the needs of educators in the way that we would like. There are alternative platforms that are more geared toward personal connection and for greater ease of use and turn taking. Some of these Zoom alternatives include AirMeet. AirMeet has avatars that allow you to sit in a room at a table that emulate having water cooler conversations or exchanging ideas over lunch. It's good for social networking, to be able to have conferences, and to feel like you're moving around an actual room in a virtual room. Another alternative is Whereby. Whereby is a free platform for one-to-one meetings with no app installation, and it utilizes the same meeting link every time. So if your students want to meet together for an assignment or socially outside of a Zoom platform, they can utilize Whereby to connect, to have conversations academically or otherwise. The times we live in are certainly stressful. And when we think about emergency remote teaching, that stress can be amplified. So there are ways in which we as educators are calming ourselves down, such as mental wellness talk. This can be modeled for our students in order to help them develop strategies to cope. Another strategy is to have small and frequent assignments and check-ins instead of the high stakes one paper at the end of a term sort of idea or a major test. These smaller frequent opportunities to check in to see how your students are doing allow them to be able to track their own progress, and for them that might minimize stress. There's also many opportunities to use resources that are at the ready and available, such as open book for quizzes or for assignments or even for tests. Students aren't expected then to memorize the content, but instead to be able to use the resources available to them in order to best maximize what it is they understand about the content. And all of these tend to minimize stress for students, for ourselves, and make the education opportunities more meaningful. Assessment is our way of keeping our students accountable to understanding and showing their mastery of the content. So as we design our assessments, we want to be able to use them to inform us, to inform the students on how they're doing. We want to remind them of our expectations around what an assessment is and how it's used. And if there are any instances of academic integrity that come into play, be consistent in dealing with them. Help students to know that you're fair and also consistent with everyone.
It's time for shameless self-promotion. And in this case, I'm part of this team funded by National Science Foundation. And we're working on these goals, project goals shown here. So our goal is really to improve ERT in general, especially in STEM, but do that by documenting and sharing creative ERT solutions and also building this community of educators to develop some of these new ideas. And I'm sharing our website here too. So please feel free to visit our website. In conclusion, I think the bottom line here is without compassion and care, nothing else really matters. And that's one of the reasons why we have our title for the presentation, Mindful and Compassionate ERT. A lot of times what we're talking about in the presentation are common sense types of things, but without being mindful, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to implement these in your classes. In particular, I would say you want to be proactive and you want to be more organized and not waiting until problems arise is really key to success. Here are some references we've used to prepare our presentation today. We're sharing our contact information here. So please feel free to contact us if you have any questions or any ideas you want to share with us. Jill, do you have anything you want to say?
We look forward to interacting with you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you both for sharing this and raising, I think, this issue with us as educators, in particular in a time of ERT. It's been, as you've both said, and many of us have experienced a very stressful experience. And you know, the one thing that kind of strikes me is the why of your talk. I can imagine that initially, as many faculty were sort of pushed into service, if you will, in by ERT, by the pandemic, we had to pay a lot of attention to the technology issues and struggles and how we get content there, and then how do we measure students and how do we know that they're not, you know, violating academic integrity. And by paying so much attention, we can lose attention, we can lose focus a bit on the human being. So I'd like just to ask you both to maybe kind of reiterate a little bit about the importance of the why. How does that connect to this ERT experience? And Jill, maybe I could start with you there.
I really think it's about being responsive. At the beginning of the pandemic, when things just sort of turned to remote overnight, many of our students disappeared.
Mm.
And they questioned whether they could do this, or they questioned in what ways they'd be able to plug in. Did they have the technical skills? And bringing them back into the learning community requires us to be able to be considerate of what's going on in their lives, considerate of the family demands that they're managing, and really rethinking the ways in which they can meet the expectations of what we set in our syllabi and in our classrooms, while also fulfilling those academic requirements. So for me, it really comes from bringing them back as active participants and showing them that this is something they can do.
It's almost like a hurdle you have to overcome, right? The technology is, in this case, in the speed of by which all this happened, became a barrier. And JR, maybe I'll flip this one over to you then.
Yeah.
The words I jotted down when you talked about mindfulness was intention
Mhm.
and intentionality. That is planning for this sort of bringing that human back into the picture. Did you experience that as well?
Yeah, and I think the biggest, I would say, challenge in many situations I've heard about and I ran into has been people not, trying to be understanding to each other.
Mm,
And with just a little bit of this attitude of being more mindful and compassionate, in many situations, these conflicts or these problems could have been solved.
mm,
And I always feel very sad about that. And that's one of the reasons why when we started with this presentation, it was too much focused on technology. And it's
mhm,
been sort of a journey, I would say, because it has really evolved into this idea of being more mindful and being more compassionate. And that makes all this difference in the world.
mm,
And that's exactly what I think Jill was talking about
mm.
earlier, and we're definitely on the same page.
I'm wondering if you've ever had to use your oops coupon with your students.
Yeah, I already used it a couple of times this semester. So
I love that, by the way. I thought that was a great idea.
yeah,
We
and
need to have those in our pocket so I can pull those out. And I think the need to be
Mhm.
sort of forgiving and cut people a break
Yes,
in
exactly.
is
Yeah, it's
really
like a referee, for soccer, you have a red card, yellow card,
yeah,
those
yeah.
types of things.
This is
But
a warning,
I
but
don't want
yeah,
to hand out, red
right,
cards to my
right.
students. And what happens is they're very like
Mm,
sheepish about or shy about asking for these opportunities. And by making these things official, I
mm,
think they have more courage to ask for favors. And on the receiving side, I would say, you're always thinking about being fair to other students.
mhm,
So this sort of gives you a license to
mm.
give favors to all the students and another way of showing your compassion.
And it's in doing it in sort of an equitable way.
Mhm.
And the fact that you use or pull out your oops coupon every
Mhm.
once in a while says to the students, hey, I'm human too.
Mhm.
I may make mistakes here as well.
And
Jill, which leads me to a second
mhm.
question I want to direct to you then. This presentation has been a lot about thinking of our students, right? And thinking about I think you spoke specifically about the circumstances that they have. They're now at home. They may have family obligations. They may have children. They still have life to live, and now they're in this pressure cooker. How about mindfulness and compassion for us as faculty members, us as teachers? How did you deal with that, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, for me, in this era of always working at home and being at home, your office is your kitchen, your
Mm,
bedroom, your dining room. And at a certain point, that just gives you license and permission to work 24/7.
mhm,
Mhm.
And we need to be kind to ourselves and compassionate to ourselves by turning it off at a certain point
mhm,
and just recognizing that we can't be answering emails and solving problems deep into the midnight or 1 o'clock hour. We have to set boundaries in order to keep
mhm,
ourselves healthy and in order to help us stay focused in the times where we really do need to be on.
mhm. Does that include, this is something I've heard other faculty talking about, communicating some of those boundaries to your learners, to your students? And saying, I'm not available to you 24 hours. If I get a email or a note from you, I promise I'll get back within, I don't know, 12 hours, 24 hours, or whatever that time frame is. But sort of keep, so that they also know you're a human being who has needs and have to attend to those needs as well in order to stay healthy to help them.
Yeah, for me, that depends on the urgency level. Sometimes if people are in a true emergency and they're in a hospital or
Mhm.
something and you're supposed to be in a meeting with them, even if it's good to know and check in and let them know you are there for them if it is an emergency, but then to, yes, definitely set those boundaries of 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. each evening and try to keep to that.
Mhm. That way everybody kind of knows the rules of the game, so to speak. JR, I happen to know one of your methods of taking care of yourself. You're a talented musician. Is that part of your sort of mindfulness and compassion experience as well?
I think drop that talented part, I would say. But in my case, yeah, it's my, I would say, coping mechanism.
Mm,
And I mean, like when I was growing up, I was really into music and
mm,
I never had a chance to pursue it professionally. But as soon as I hit, like, I'm not going to disclose my age, a certain age. I just couldn't wait anymore. So I started singing. I started playing the piano. I was taking formal lessons and so on. And of course, there are so many things to be frustrated about these days. But I mean, those moments I have when I'm doing my music really makes me, be calm and
mm,
also, I mean, think about, you know, others even more. So in that sense, I think it's a great place. My secret, I would say refuge in this case.
mhm,
I have, and yeah, it's been working out pretty well. And I also run, a couple miles every
mhm.
other day, so that helps too. So I think this health uh, is really both mental and physical, and you really have to pay attention to both.
Sure, sure.
Mhm.
So my last thought for you is you've talked about taking care of the students and
Mhm.
so forth, and thinking about
Mhm.
being empathetic to their needs and so forth. And then you talked about as an individual, as a faculty member. What do you do when you have situations where you're trying to be empathetic, you're trying to be understanding, you're trying to be compassionate, and the individual on the other end, maybe a student, may also be another faculty member, is resistant to that, is not
Mhm.
able to kind of respond? How do we deal with those? What do we do there?
Mhm.
JR, if I can start with you.
In my case, I think what I'm trying to do usually is to understand where the student or the faculty is coming from. And I think that's part of being also being mindful and compassionate. And you cannot really force these things over people. You really have to take your time and you really try to show your compassion in a way so that it is not really obtruding. So I think part of practicing being mindful and also compassionate is to know your boundaries and
Mm,
to know the time when you stop.
mhm. Joe, I would imagine there's a healthy dose of trust that needs to be built up in that scenario as well. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I think sometimes the most difficult to reach faculty members or students, once you break through and have that trust building conversation, become your closest friends and your closest
Mhm,
allies. And it's just that one sort of barrier that's standing in the way. And I encourage us to push beyond that boundary. When someone says, "I'm not ready" or "not now," to keep at it, be consistent, and try again. It's worth building those relationships and to extend those compassion and courtesies to one another.
and trust takes time, right? It's not something that comes overnight. It's through experience and through your reaction to things where you begin to build that, so you can move to that empathy that you're speaking of.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much. This has been fascinating for me. It's caused me a lot to reflect on my own teaching, my own style, and reminds me of the need to be compassionate, mindful, and always have my oops coupon nearby. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry.